at 560theanswer.com. Now, from the Signature Bank Studios. If you're looking for the latest news, insight into what it means, and the sharpest opinion, there's only one station in Chicago where you can turn, and it's this one.
Well, I learned...
560, The Answer.
Excuse me, Mr. Announcer. Learned a lot this past hour.
I tell you, that U.S. Senate race in Illinois 2026 is dripping with intrigue. That's what I can say about it.
And here's Rahm Emanuel. He's
ways.
been making the moves. He was on Bill Maher. He's been on CNN, MSNBC, with pretty much the same message.
It's toxic. I don't think you have to caveat or put a disclaimer on it. And I think the way I would see it is there's two words that define the Democratic Party for the public: weak and woke.
But is it the world, or is America ready for a moderate Democrat?
You know,
is Illinois ready for that? Because we've got a lot of openings. I think governor, U.S. Senate, mayor, those are three options.
I think Illinois is ready for a moderate Democrat, but one has to overcome this. I mean, maybe not so soon as 28. 26 is the... What's JB going to do? I mean, his record is so tied up with wokeism that, I think he's got to continue to stay the course.
He went up and spoke, I think, in New Hampshire, basically saying, make Republican people's lives hell.
Yeah. Not only that,
have them feel the pain.
He controls everything about the party in Illinois. He funds everything. And he's basically... I don't think he's going to go anywhere in 26. I think he's going to run for governor.
You think he's going to run for governor again?
Yeah, and then run for president as a sitting governor. Because what else is J.B. Pritzker going to do?
Well, what is he?
What else is he
let's just say, hypothetically, Juliana Stratton becomes, wins the Democratic nomination for U.S. Senate.
Yeah.
Who's going to be his lieutenant governor?
Who's going to be his lieutenant governor?
Yeah.
He'll choose somebody who'll be capable of running the state as he runs for the presidency.
Is he even capable of running the state?
Who, her?
No, Pritzker.
Is he? So far, he's shown he isn't, but nobody's going to challenge him because he has so much money, and he controls everything about the party in the state. He controls everything. I mean, he's like Bruce Rauner, controlled everything, and they did it with money. They control all the House races, the Senate races, and I think he's basically unbeatable in 26 for governor. And if he wants it, he can have it. He doesn't have to work that hard. He can still prepare his presidential campaign. I think it's easier to run as a sitting governor for president than it does in a governor 2 years, having been the governor 2 years prior to the presidential race.
All right.
That's just my opinion.
Well, we love your opinion. That's Charles Thomas. I just call you Chuck. Hey, Chuck.
You call me Chuck.
Hey, Charlie.
I've been Chuck but one time in my life, and that was when I was in college, because there was another guy, upperclassman, who was named Charles. So they called him Charles. So I had to be Chuck.
For how long?
For about 2 or 3. Well, my college career, I was Chuck.
Yeah. Where did you go to college?
Mizzou.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah.
Mizzou.
Yeah.
Okay,
M-I-Z. Z-O-U.
A lot of strong journalists come out of Mizzou.
It's the oldest journalism school in these United States. It was the first, and they made me right. They trained me up right, as they say.
Yes.
But I don't know what they're doing there now, or at any journalism school, because the stuff that I see every day and read in the paper and
there's grammatical errors all over the place. I mean, where are the editors?
But where are the ethics? Come on.
Yeah.
I mean, where is the middle of the road? Where are the both sides of the story?
Wall Street Journal, maybe? Maybe theblaze.com?
Maybe theblaze.com. I think if you take the Blaze as the whole thing, not just looking at one particular program, yeah, you might be able to say that. Maybe.
Well, I mentioned theblaze.com because our next guest, who's joining us now, is Chuck Caro. He wrote an article for The Blaze. He normally writes for The Blaze, but he also is a was CNN's very first special assignment correspondent, served with the 20th Special Forces Group Airborne, former outside consultant to the Pentagon's Office of Net Assessment for 25 years, and he joins us now on our Turnkey.pro answer line. Good morning, Chuck. How are you?
I'm fine. Poor Charles had to be Chuck for just a little time. Sorry, Charles.
Was there a time in your life, Chuck, when you were called Charles?
Yeah, but I'm from Rhode Island, and we skip the so it becomes Charles.
Charles.
Oh, yeah, Charles.
Charles.
Or
So
Cholly, Tally.
Were you ever Charlie?
Well, when I was a little kid, and until my uncle Hector came in, he was a B-17 pilot, and he goes, "You're going to be a flyer, kid." And I ended up as a flyer, and he said, "You're going to be a Chuck like Jaeger." So here I am. So from 3 years old on.
Perfect. So Pete Hegseth is Defense Secretary. How do you think it's going so far?
You know, I like the guy. I mean, if you read his book and his articles, you know, he's got a warrior soul. Now, yeah, okay, he was a major, not a major general, but you know, that the part that impresses me is the warrior soul. And I think the other thing is he's also telegenic, so he can make his point. I think he's getting a tremendous amount of resistance from the Pentagon, which is an extraordinarily conservative organization, conservative in the worst sense. Basil Littlehart, the famous interwar British strategist, once said, "It's really easy to put a new idea in the military mind. The hard part is putting the old one out." And I think that's what Pete Hegseth is up against.
Well, you just mentioned something that the Pentagon is extremely conservative. Can you give us some examples?
Well, yeah. I mean, look how long it took to get a United States Air Force. How about that for starters? You know, huge resistance from the Army and Navy because, well, air doesn't count. You know, the onset of ballistic missiles, nuclear weapons, all kinds of resistance from anything that's new.
Are we seeing that now? You know, I keep seeing these reports about how the Russians have developed these new weapons, these hypersonic missiles, an Oreshnik missile or whatever it is. We don't seem to have anything like that.
No, that's not true, Charles.
Okay, school me, man, because I'm just a civilian.
Here, I'll give you a homework project, okay? When do you think was the first time the United States started experimenting with hypersonic missiles? What year?
I'm going to guess in the 50s.
1947.
Whoa.
I was close.
Yeah, and it worked like this. "Hello, Werner. Welcome to White Sands. Right here we have something the Fuhrer didn't have, money. So why don't you go out and try all these weird things you had on a drawing board?" So in 1947, they built a two-stage V2 called Project Hermes 2, and it had on top of it a delta-winged platform that would have been ramjet powered, and they launched it. It got over Mach 3 in 1947, and that's without any engines. This is a glide vehicle. Unfortunately, in one test, somebody put the reciprocal heading into the missile, and instead of landing going White Sands towards Colorado, went White Sands towards Mexico and left a 30-foot crater across the border. But the system itself worked. And then we had in the 50s something called a Navajo, which looked like a subscale space shuttle, which was a ramjet-powered, delta-winged kind of boost glide vehicle. We don't need that. We'll just stick with ballistic. So we've been playing around with this for years. In the 60s, we had something called ASSET, Aerothermodynamic Structural Systems Environmental Tests, launching them off Atlas missiles, and it was a maneuvering warhead, a MARV. Now, we've done all this before, but, you know, there are tides and budget changes. You start on one project, say, okay, we can't afford it, and then it gets lost in history, and then suddenly we need it again.
Well, what about nuclear testing at White Sands Missile Range? I've been there several times because I used to live in El Paso as a reporter, and we'd always go up there when they were trying new things.
Well, no, not nuclear weapons. Only, near White Sands and Alamogordo.
Alamogordo.
Just that one. That was a Trinity test in July of 1945, just once. But there were missile tests galore that the Army started with all those Operation Paperclip engineers that were brought over from Germany at the end of the war.
Wow. And now we have a new kind of war, the info war with China. But you wrote an article that we already built the fix. What does that mean?
Yeah, well, we got to understand, the idea of China is that, the popular idea is what we're dealing with is Godzilla. Well, no. What we're dealing with is more like the Blob. You ever saw that famous movie? Mm-hmm. A slow motion creeping, devouring everything over time. To understand China, you have to go back to 1999 and read a book called Unrestricted Warfare, and written by Colonels Liang and Kwang Su of the People's Liberation Army and People's Liberation Air Force, and talked about the ways to engage against the United States without starting a war until they became a peer competitor. And it's a very scary book because everything they predicted in 1999 has become policy. And you'll see the Chinese aggressively competing with us in diplomatic, information, military, and economic spheres. Not just, DF-26 ship killer missile. It's all the way across the tenets of national power, and it's scary. I highly recommend that Chinese communist book, Unrestricted Warfare, to understand what they're doing. Now, in the information war, the Chinese know that information is a way to shape populations over time. The important thing is over time. You were a TV reporter once. Mm-hmm. One story on one night isn't going to have effect. But if you do a series of stories across a month or so, people start to get the message. And we're seeing this, Chinese and TikTok, very famous. Oh, no, it can't be. Yeah, it is. Slow creeping information. Now, we used to have a U.S. information agency long ago, was given away by Clinton as a peace dividend. And then, President Trump has killed the Office of Global Media, which was a spinoff from USIA. What we need is a brain that works across decades to counter other nations' information warfare against us. And so starting in the 1990s and finishing around 2016 or so, I worked for the Office of Net Assessment, which was the internal Pentagon think tank, and I approached the boss, Mr. Andrew W. Marshall, who was essentially the chief strategist of the United States for 43 years, from 1973 on. His call sign or his nickname was Yoda because he literally was the wise man at the Pentagon that only a few knew existed. And I got to work for him. So I went to him as an ex-TV guy and said, look, there are tenets of television not understood, and it's an extremely powerful medium. The problem with our military, CIA, et cetera, is that we change people over time. 2 years in the military, maybe 4. They don't do information across years. And that's what's needed if you're going to do any kind of televised information. And we now know the televised information we carry in our shirt pocket and call a smartphone,
right,
which is essentially a television transmitter and receiver. And as an ex-TV reporter, that trying to explain to your parents while you're at home why you're shouting at the TV screen while another reporter is reporting, because you understand the grammar, the syntax, and the structure of video.
And I do that.
Why is he doing a stand-up bridge in the middle of this report? Well, he doesn't have the B-roll to cover it. Well, I can't give that credibility. He doesn't have the B-roll. But people don't understand that. And I'm sure in your lifetime you were trying to explain to your family why you were doing that.
Right. So, to what extent has China weaponized information flows to shape perceptions in the U.S. and possibly our allies?
Well, I tell you what they do understand is they understand the idea of suborning kinetic activities to information. If you look at their Belt and Road projects, what they're doing is, providing monies and loans to create a better economic environment, and then publicizing that in all those nations around the world in which they're trying to extend their influence. And here, just last week, President Trump announces the Golden Dome 2 weeks ago, and they come back with a very forceful global effort to say, no, this is offensive and destabilizing when we're talking about the defense of the United States. And, Secretary Hegseth was asked, hey, what about the Chinese claims? He said, no, that's not true. And that's fine, but it's one time. And the Chinese will continue to start pointing at this as a destabilizing force to all the rest of the countries in the world. And we, as yet, don't have an effective way that provides constancy and consistency in information, especially against this wave of information that Chinese are pushing against us.
Do you think we need a Golden Dome, though, over D.C. now that we mentioned it?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, the fact is that, nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles were created with people who had what we call slide rules. Mm-hmm. And so now the technology to build these things isn't just amongst the superpowers. I mean, look at Iran. And even with all the Israeli, interference in trying, they're slowly going towards a nuclear weapon, and they also have ballistic missiles. Well, once they get a bomb, everybody else in the Middle East is going to have one. Trust me, the Saudis aren't going to wait around for very long before they go nuclear. They bought missiles from China 30 years ago. But, if you bother to look it up, they've got intermediate range conventional ballistic missiles. It wouldn't take long to develop a nuclear weapon to put on those things. And you now have a huge proliferation of nuclear weapons. So having a Golden Dome, not a bad idea.
Chuck, President Putin does not appear to be letting up in his assault on Ukraine. By all accounts, the Russians are winning the war.
Yeah.
What do we do?
A couple of things. The target isn't the battlefield in Ukraine. The target is Putin. You got to understand that Putin's Russia is not the Soviet Union.
Got it.
I mean, their economy is the size of Italy. Okay, well, they're basically a third world power with nuclear weapons. The target, Putin is in a situation much like our Nicholas was in 1917, 1918. National treasure is going down the drain. His army is going into a wood chipper, and his position among the supporting people, the nobility, was shaky, and so the Kerensky Revolution came about. But Kerensky simply deposed the Tsar from power to stabilize the country against the Germans, and the Bolsheviks took advantage of that because the Germans sent Lenin into that liquid situation, and you saw the result. Okay, Russia isn't the problem. China is the problem. Right now, Putin is borrowing money and selling his oil to China in order to fund his war. Putin is the idea. The target for the Ukrainians should be, what do we need to do to depose Putin? Not what do we need to do to hold steady at the battlefield. That's true. They're not going to be able to win on the battlefield unless the entire Western world ups the ante with all kinds of weapons.
But he doesn't. But the reports are that he doesn't have troops. That they're using press gangs to get people to go fight the Russians.
That's absolutely correct. And what is needed is to get that information out to the Russian population so that they create an unstable political situation for Putin. Look, Putin has created oligarchs that now support him.
But what about the
like-
Ukrainians? They don't seem to have any people left in order to fight the Russians. They're running out of people. At what point does NATO put boots on the ground in Ukraine?
The problem with the boots on the ground is then what you get is the Russian population rallying around Mother Russia. You don't want that either. Again, the target should be Putin and opposing Putin and not trying to win on a battlefield.
All right.
As you said, they're running out of people. What you need to do is somehow, and there are ways to do this, cause instability in the Russian population so that he can no longer command.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there for today. The article, you can read his work in theblaze.com. Chuck, always a pleasure having you on. I learned so much about our history, and you're the best. And he's the CNN's very first special assignment correspondent, served with the 20th Special Forces, and worked at the Pentagon. An all-around good guy. Thanks, Chuck Caro, for joining us. We appreciate it.
Anytime, Amy and Charles.
Thank you.
Thanks. And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
The more you listen, the more you'll know. This is Chicago's Morning Answer. Morning Answer on AM 560. The Answer.
Hi, Amy Jacobson here. With the crime we're seeing in Illinois, I know how important it is to keep my home and my family safe. That's why I chose Goldilocks for my home security. One of their awesome technicians just came over and gave me a free assessment of my home. They found vulnerabilities that intruders typically look for and created a personalized plan for me. Goldilocks offers